The Resonance Matrix Volume 3 Episode 4 Discernment, Separating Signal from Noise. Hello, and welcome to the Resonance Matrix, a mirror linguistic hypothesis series, Volume 3, Silencing the Field. Return to Self, Episode 4 Discernment, Separating Signal from Noise. There is a moment that arrives quietly, after stillness has done its work, after sensation has begun to return, after orientation has given you somewhere to stand. It is not a moment of clarity, it is not relief, it is not certainty, it is the moment when everything feels equally loud. After long periods of override, suppression, urgency, or survival, the nervous system does not immediately sort experience into neat categories. When thawing completes its first phase, sensation returns without hierarchy. Everything registers at once, every input carries weight, every feeling demands attention, every option feels possible and overwhelming. This is where many people assume something has gone wrong. They mistake uniform intensity for confusion. They mistake equality of signal for chaos. They mistake the absence of hierarchy for failure. But this moment is not a collapse. It is the precondition for discernment. Discernment does not arrive as insight. It arrives as a difference. And difference cannot be felt until the system is no longer frozen, no longer numb, no longer dissociated from itself. Before discernment, there is a strange plateau. Sensation is back, but meaning is not yet organized. Orientation has stabilized the ground, but direction has not yet emerged. The nervous system is awake, but not selective. Everything feels the same. This is not because nothing matters. It is because the body has not yet relearned what belongs to it. For many people, this phase is deeply unsettling. After years of having to react quickly, decide fast, explain immediately, or justify instincts, the absence of internal hierarchy feels like danger. The mind searches for a rule. The body waits for a cue. Old patterns whisper that clarity must be forced. But discernment cannot be forced. It cannot be reasoned into existence. It emerges only when the nervous system is safe enough to compare, not evaluate, not judge, but to compare. Discernment is not the act of deciding what is right. It is the felt recognition that this is different from that, and the difference is subtle. Discernment does not shout. It does not argue. It does not persuade. It does not justify itself with language. It appears as a quiet leaning, a gentle pull, a slight preference that cannot yet be explained. This is why discernment is often missed. People look for conclusions. Discernment offers contrast. People look for answers. Discernment offers orientation. People look for certainty. Discernment offers fit. When the nervous system has spent a long time in environments that flattened experience, where urgency demanded immediate response, where danger made everything equally important, where survival erased nuance, it loses its ability to discriminate, not because it is broken, but because discrimination was unsafe. In threat, everything matters. In safety, different returns. This episode begins at the threshold where difference becomes possible again. Not a dramatic difference, not a moral difference, not intellectual difference, but somatic difference. The difference between something that drains you and something that doesn't. The difference between something that tightens you and something that allows breath. The difference between something that requires effort and something that carries itself. Discernment does not begin with values. It begins with physiology, and because of that, it often feels disappointingly quiet. There is no lightning bolt, no sudden knowing, no moment where everything clicks into place. Instead, there is a subtle shift in how the body responds, a decrease in internal noise when something aligns, a soft resistance when something does not. This subtlety is why discernment is so easily overridden. We are trained to trust intensity over fit, urgency over resonance, confidence over coherence. But discernment has no urgency. It does not need to be acted on immediately. It does not demand expression. It does not insist on explanation. It simply registers. And for a nervous system that has learned to survive by moving fast, reacting quickly, or adapting continuously, this registration can feel unfamiliar, even suspicious. Many people at this stage ask themselves the same quiet question. If I don't feel pulled strongly toward anything, am I doing something wrong? The answer is no. What you are experiencing is the nervous system learning to differentiate without threat. Before discernment, difference felt dangerous. Choosing one thing meant losing another. Leaning toward something meant exposure. Preference carried consequence. So the system flattened the experience. Everything was the same because the difference was unsafe. Now, in the absence of an immediate threat, the system begins to test differences again, cautiously, quietly, without declaration. Discernment at this stage does not look like decision-making. It looks like non-engagement. It looks like the body is not mobilizing towards something it would previously have forced itself to accept. It looks like energy withdrawal without drama. This is why discernment is often mistaken for apathy. But apathy is collapse. Discernment is selectivity returning. The difference matters. Apathy is numb. Discernment is precise. Apathy shuts down. Discernment filters. Apathy disconnects. Discernment refines connection. If stillness was the nervous system stopping its bracing, and sensation was the body speaking again, then discernment is the body beginning to listen to itself. Not loudly, not defensively, not analytically. Listening through preference. Listening with ease. Listening through subtle alignment. This is the phase where many people try to figure out what they want. But discernment is not about desire. Desire can be hijacked by conditioning, by scarcity, by identity, by unresolved urgency. Discernment precedes desire. It tells you what doesn't distort you. It tells you what doesn't require effort to maintain. It tells you where energy flows without collapse, and it does this without explanation. This can be deeply uncomfortable for the mind. The mind wants reasons. The body offers contrast. The mind wants language. The body offers sensation. The mind wants certainty. The body offers probability. Discernment lives in probability, not in conclusions. At this stage, you may notice something else, an increase in tolerance for ambiguity, not intellectual tolerance, but somatic tolerance. The body no longer panics when it doesn't know yet. It no longer rushes to close the loop. This is not indecision. It is safe. A nervous system that feels safe does not need to decide immediately. It can wait for more information. It can let differences accumulate. It can allow preference to clarify itself over time. Discernment matures slowly. It is not sharpened by force. It is sharpened by consistency. The more often the nervous system is allowed to register what fits and what doesn't without consequence, the more precise discernment becomes. And this is why discernment cannot be taught as a rule set. Rules collapse nuance. Discernment restores it. Rules flatten experience. Discernment differentiates. Rules come from outside. Discernment grows from inside. This episode does not ask you to judge your choices. It does not ask you to analyze your patterns. It does not ask you to decide who you are or what you want. It asks something much quieter. Can you notice the difference without acting on it? Can you feel preference without justifying it? Can you let the body register what belongs without forcing it to speak in words? Because this is where internal reference begins to rebuild, not through assertion, not through identity, but through discrimination that does not need permission. Discernment does not make you certain. It makes you less available to noise, and that is where trust begins. This episode begins there, not at the moment of clarity, but at the moment when everything feels the same long enough for difference to emerge. Let's move deeper into the atmospheric field where discernment first flickers, before it is named, before it is understood, before it is trusted. The atmospheric hook, the subtle difference. Discernment does not arrive as a thought. It arrives as a pause between two similar things. Not a dramatic pause, not a decisive one, just enough space for the body to register that something has shifted, that what is being felt now is not the same as what was felt a moment ago. At first, this difference is almost too quiet to trust. It does not announce itself with confidence. It does not insist. It does not make a case for itself. It appears as a barely perceptible leaning toward one experience and away from another, without explanation, without urgency, without narrative. This is why discernment is so often missed. We are trained to look for decisions. The body offers contrast. We are trained to look for clarity. The body offers gradation. We are trained to look for answers. The body offers difference. After stillness has softened the system, after sensation has returned without meaning, something new begins to happen. The nervous system starts to compare experiences not by intensity, but by quality. One interaction leaves you slightly more open. Another leaves you subtly tighter. One choice carries weight in the chest. Another feels neutral. One environment requires effort to stay present. Another does not. These differences are not moral. They are not intellectual. They are not even emotional in the way we usually define emotion. They are physiological preferences. The nervous system quietly sorting what allows coherence from what requires compensation. And it does this before the mind knows what it is doing. This is why discernment often feels frustrating at first. The mind wants reasons. It wants language. It wants to know why one thing feels different from another, but the body does not begin with why. It begins with how it responds, how breath changes, how posture adjusts, how attention either settles or scatters. Discernment begins in these micro-adjustments, so small they are often dismissed as irrelevant. But relevance is not determined by volume. The nervous system does not raise its voice to be heard. It waits to see if it is listened to. In early discernment, nothing is clear enough to act on. There is no instruction attached to the signal, no command to leave or stay, no directive to choose or reject. There is only a subtle difference between experiences that appear similar on the surface. Two conversations that both seem pleasant, but one leaves you quietly depleted, and the other does not. Two opportunities that both look promising, but one feels slightly heavier in the body. Two silences, one restful, one constricting. These are not conclusions. They are comparisons. Discernment does not begin by telling you what to do. It begins by showing you that not everything feels the same anymore, and this alone can feel destabilizing. When a nervous system has lived in urgency or override, it learns to treat everything as equally important. Difference collapses under pressure. In survival, nuance disappears. You do what works quickly, not what fits deeply. So when difference begins to re-emerge, it can feel unfamiliar, even threatening. The mind may step in quickly, trying to categorize the sensation. Is this anxiety? Is this intuition? Is this fear? Is this resistance? Is this avoidance? But discernment does not need to be named to function. In fact, naming too early often interrupts it. The body is not asking for interpretation. It is asking for space to register, and registration takes time. Discernment matures through repetition, not analysis. The more often the nervous system is allowed to notice differences without consequence, the more precise its signals become. This is why discernment is quiet. It cannot compete with urgency. It cannot survive constant demand. It needs an environment where nothing is immediately required. In such an environment, the body begins to lean, not dramatically, just enough. A slight preference toward what feels less effortful to maintain, a subtle pull away from what requires self-suppression, a gentle settling in what allows presence without vigilance. These leanings are not yet decisions, they are pre-decisional signals, the raw material of discernment before it hardens into choice, and because they do not come with justification, they are often overridden. People tell themselves they are being lazy, or picky, or irrational, or dramatic, or ungrateful, or indecisive, but discernment is not indecision, it is pre-decision. It is the nervous system gathering data without rushing to a conclusion, and this gathering cannot happen under pressure. Discernment requires a strange kind of patience, not the patience of waiting for answers, but the patience of allowing difference to become clear on its own. This is why discernment does not thrive in environments that demand constant explanation. Explanation collapses nuance into language. Discernment lives in nuance. In early stages, discernment may feel disappointingly subtle. You may wonder if you are imagining it, if you are reading too much into things, if you are avoiding commitment, if you're overthinking, but discernment does not feel like thinking. It feels like less effort. The nervous system relaxes slightly in one direction and braces slightly in another. This is the signal, not excitement, not certainty, not conviction, but ease. Ease is not pleasure. Ease is coherence, and coherence is the nervous system's primary orientation signal. In environments that respect discernment, ease is allowed to guide action. In environments that reward performance or compliance, ease is often pathologized as laziness or lack of ambition. So many people have learned to distrust it. They have learned to override ease in favor of urgency, expectation, obligation, or identity. Discernment returns when that override stops, and when it returns, it does not shout. It waits. It waits to see if it will be honored. At first, discernment may only appear in retrospect. You may notice that something feels wrong only after leaving it, or that something felt right only after spending time in it. This delay is normal. The system is recalibrating. Over time, the delay shortens. The body begins to register differences earlier, before words, before commitment, before explanation. This is discernment strengthening, not as confident, as sensitivity. Sensitivity not as vulnerability, but as resolution. The ability to detect fine-grained differences without becoming overwhelmed. This is why discernment is incompatible with urgency. Urgency flattens the difference. Discernment restores it. Urgency demands action. Discernment invites noticing. Urgency moves you forward. Discernment tells you where forward actually is, and importantly, discernment does not care about being right. It cares about alignment. Alignment not as ideology, but as felt coherence between inner state and outer engagement. When discernment begins to function again, life does not suddenly become clearer. In fact, it may feel more ambiguous at first, because you are no longer forcing certainty where it does not belong. Ambiguity here is not confusion. It is precision emerging slowly. This is the atmosphere in which discernment grows. Quiet comparison, subtle leaning, non-urgent noticing. Nothing is demanded. Nothing is decided. Difference is allowed to exist without consequence. And in that allowance, the nervous system relearns something essential. It is safe to notice what feels different. From there, discernment deepens, not into judgment, but into trust. When you are ready, we will move into the next layer, where discernment begins to engage the cognitive system, and we explore why the mind so often tries to override this quiet process with explanation, meaning, or premature choice. The etymology and definition of discernment. What is discernment? Discernment has been misunderstood for a very long time. Not because it is complex, but because it's been repeatedly confused with things that look similar from the outside, but feel entirely different from the inside. Judgment, analysis, criticism, evaluation, preference, even intuition. In everyday language, discernment is often treated as a cognitive skill, the ability to tell the difference, to choose wisely, to assess quality, to see clearly. But this framing already places discernment too high in the system. It assumes thought comes first. It assumes discernment is something the mind does. What this misses is where discernment actually begins, not in the mind, not in language, not in values, but in sensation. Before the word discernment ever enters awareness, something quieter has already happened. The nervous system has registered contrast, not right versus wrong, not good versus bad. Just this feels different from that, and that difference arrived without argument. This is the essential distinction that stabilizes discernment as a biological process rather than a moral or intellectual one. Discernment does not evaluate, it discriminates. And discrimination here does not mean exclusion or superiority, it means the capacity to sense difference without urgency, defense, or story. To understand discernment accurately, we need to separate it from the processes it is most often mistaken for. Judgment is evaluative. It assigns value. It moves quickly toward a conclusion. It often carries emotional charge, justification, and identity. Judgment answers questions like, is this good or bad, or is this right or wrong, or what does this say about me or them? Analysis is cognitive. It breaks experience into parts, seeks causality, and attempts to explain. Analysis answers questions like, why did this happen, or what does this mean, or how do these pieces fit together? Criticism is relational. It positions the observer above or outside the observed. It often arises from unresolved tension or unmet expectations and answers questions like what is wrong here or what should be different. Discernment is none of these. Discernment does not ask, is this good? It asks nothing. Discernment does not ask why. It waits. Discernment does not say this should be different. It simply registers that it is different. This distinction matters because when discernment is confused with judgment, people either suppress it or weaponize it. They silence it to be kind, accommodating, or agreeable, or they amplify it into criticism and call that clarity. Both distort the original signal. Discernment, in its pure form, has no edge, no sharpness, no accusation, no urgency to act. It does not require agreement or disagreement. It does not seek permission or dominance. It is simply the nervous system recognizing contrast without needing to resolve it. From an etymological perspective, discernment traces back to the Latin discernere, meaning to separate, to distinguish, or to perceive a difference. Importantly, this separation was not originally moral. It was perceptual. To discern was to notice distinction, to tell one thing from another without assigning worth. Over time, cultural and institutional frameworks moralized this capacity. Discernment became associated with wisdom, virtue, and correctness. It became something to achieve, rather than something to allow. But the original function remains intact beneath those layers. Discernment is not about being right. It is about being oriented, and orientation does not require explanation. This is why discernment often feels uncomfortable in its early stages. When a nervous system begins to recover from override, from urgency, compliance, or chronic adaptation, discernment reemerges before confidence does. The person begins to feel subtle differences without being able to justify them. And because we are culturally trained to justify perception before trusting it, these differences are often dismissed. People tell themselves they are being irrational, or difficult, or indecisive, or avoidant. But what is actually happening is that the nervous system is regaining its ability to discriminate signal from noise without needing to defend itself. This brings us to the working definition that anchors this episode. Discernment is the nervous system's ability to distinguish signal from noise without urgency or defense. Each part of this definition matters. Ability discernment is not a belief or a trait. It is a capacity that can be strengthened or weakened depending on the environment, safety, and load. Nervous system discernment originates in physiology. It is not the first thought, value, or preference. It is a bodily registration of coherence or incoherence. Distinguished discernment recognizes difference. It does not collapse experiences into sameness, nor does it exaggerate contrast into polarity. Signal from noise signal refers to information that supports orientation and coherence. Noise refers to information that distracts, overwhelms, or requires unnecessary compensation. Discernment does not reject noise. It simply stops treating it as directive. Without urgency collapses discernment. When action is demanded, difference is overridden. Discernment requires time, even if only a few seconds, to register contrast. Without defense biases perception. When the system is protecting itself, it interprets a difference as a threat. Discernment requires relative safety. This definition places discernment firmly in the body before the mind ever engages. From a mere linguistic hypothesis perspective, this sequencing is essential. Language does not generate discernment, it follows it. Words arrive after contrast has been registered. When language arrives too early, it reshapes the signal. It turns raw discrimination into narrative, justification, or identity. This is why discernment weakens in environments that demand immediate articulation. If you must explain every preference, justify every hesitation, or defend every boundary, the nervous system learns to preemptively suppress discernment. It becomes safer to comply than to notice. In such environments, discernment is mistaken for criticism because the only time difference is allowed to surface is when it is framed as an argument. But true discernment does not argue. It does not need to. It simply leans. This leaning is often described as intuition, but intuition carries cultural baggage, mystical, prophetic, or exceptional. Discernment is more mundane and more reliable. It is the everyday capacity to notice when something fits and when it does not, without needing to elevate that noticing into special insight. It is the difference between this is wrong and this does not sit. The latter requires no justification. This is why discernment often feels quieter than people expect. It does not come with adrenaline. It does not feel empowering in the dramatic sense. It does not create momentum. In fact, discernment often slows things down, and this slowing is precisely what makes it threatening to systems built on urgency, productivity, or compliance. Discernment interrupts momentum not by opposing it, but by refusing to be swept along by it. This refusal is not conscious at first. It appears as hesitation, as a delay, as a sense of not yet without explanation. This is not indecision. It is discrimination still forming. In healthy nervous systems, discernment develops through repeated exposure to differences without consequence. The more often a system is allowed to notice contrast without being forced to act or explain, the more precise its discernment becomes. This is why children, before heavy social conditioning, often display strong discernment. They move toward what feels coherent and away from what does not, without apology. Over time, many are taught to override this capacity in favor of politeness, obedience, or performance. Discernment is not lost. It is suppressed, and what suppresses it most effectively is moral framing. When discernment is framed as being picky, being negative, being judgmental, or being difficult, the nervous system learns that noticing difference carries relational risk. It becomes safer to treat everything as equal, even when it is not. This flattening of difference is not neutrality, it is disorientation, and disorientation is costly. Without discernment, the system relies on external cues to decide what matters. Authority, consensus, urgency, or identity begin to replace the internal signal. Over time, this produces fatigue, resentment, and confusion, not because choices are wrong, but because they are not grounded in discrimination. Discernment restores grounding not by telling you what to choose, but by reintroducing contrast into experience. From there, choice becomes possible without force. This is why discernment is foundational to agency, boundary, voice, and sovereignty later in the arc. Without discernment, all of those become performances or reactions. With discernment, they become expressions of coherence. It is important to emphasize again that discernment is not evaluation. Evaluation ranks. Discernment distinguishes. Evaluation says this is better than that. Discernment says this is different from that. Evaluation seeks outcome. Discernment registers the condition. Evaluation is often driven by identity. Discernment precedes identity. This is why discernment can feel destabilizing in cultures that prioritize certainty. It introduces differences without a conclusion. It asks the system to tolerate ambiguity without filling it. And tolerance here does not mean endurance. It means allowing differences to exist without resolution. This allowance is a sign of safety. Only a nervous system that is not under threat can afford to notice a difference without immediately categorizing it. So when discernment begins to reappear, it is not a sign that something is wrong. It is a sign that safety is returning. From this place, language will eventually follow. But when it does, it will follow contrast rather than trying to create it. Words will come later. Meaning will come later. Action will come later. In the next section, we will explore what happens cognitively when discernment begins to operate, why the mind often rushes to explain difference, and how meaning-seeking can override discrimination before it has time to stabilize. But before moving forward, let this definition settle. Discernment is not a judgment you make. It is a difference your body notices when it no longer has to defend itself. The cognitive shift from overthinking to differentiation. Discernment rarely feels like clarity when it first arrives. More often, it feels like hesitation, like uncertainty without a clear cause, like a loss of confidence rather than a gain in perception. This is one of the great misunderstandings that surrounds discernment. We expect it to feel empowering, decisive, or illuminating, when in fact it often feels disorienting at the beginning. That discomfort is not a flaw in the process. It is the process. For a nervous system that has spent years, sometimes decades, operating under pressure, urgency, or external override, discernment represents a fundamental cognitive shift. The mind is no longer being driven by the need to resolve, conclude, or explain. Instead, it is being asked to tolerate difference without immediately collapsing it into meaning, and the mind does not like this at first. Under stress, the brain develops habits that prioritize speed over accuracy. These habits are adaptive in survival contexts. When a threat is present, ambiguity is dangerous. The brain learns to flatten experience, to compress nuance into binary categories like safe, unsafe, right, wrong, act, don't act. This flattening reduces cognitive load and accelerates response. But flattening has a cost. When the system exits survival mode, those same habits remain. The brain continues to seek a quick resolution even when urgency is no longer required. It rushes to interpretation. It reaches for meaning. It tries to explain the difference away, rather than allowing it to register. This is why discernment can feel uncomfortable. It interrupts a long-standing cognitive reflex, the reflex to decide rather than differentiate. From a neuroscience perspective, this shift involves a gradual rebalancing between subcortical and cortical processes. During prolonged stress or override, limbic structures, particularly the amygdala and related threat detection networks, dominate processing. Their function is not to understand, it is to prioritize relevance. They flag salience quickly and often imprecisely, erring on the side of caution. When everything feels potentially important, everything demands interpretation. As safety increases, these limbic patterns begin to quiet. This does not happen all at once. It happens unevenly, sometimes unpredictably. And during this transition, the prefrontal cortex, especially regions involved in reflective awareness and flexible attention, begins to re-engage. But here is the crucial point. The prefrontal cortex does not immediately restore clarity. It restores space. That space can feel like uncertainty. For a brain accustomed to urgency, the absence of immediate meaning can register as danger. If I don't know what this is, the system implicitly asks, how do I respond to it? This is why people often experience discernment as anxiety or confusion at first. Not because something is wrong, but because the old strategy, rapid interpretation, is no longer being reinforced. In this transitional phase, the brain is recalibrating what counts as salient. This process is sometimes described in neuroscience as a reduction of false salience. Under chronic stress, the brain flags too much as significant. Neutral stimuli feel charged. Minor differences feel threatening. Everything demands explanation. As safety returns, salience becomes more selective. Fewer things light up as urgent. More information is allowed to pass through without reaction. But to a system used to constant activation, this quieter signal landscape can feel like a loss. Loss of certainty, loss of direction, loss of control. This is where overthinking often intensifies. Overthinking is not excessive curiosity. It is an attempt to restore the old sense of certainty by force. The mind floods the field with questions, interpretations, and narratives in an effort to regain traction. It treats difference as a problem to be solved, rather than a signal to be noticed. Discernment asks for the opposite move. Instead of asking, "What does this mean?" it asks nothing at all. Instead of collapsing experience into explanation, it allows differentiation to remain open. This is a profound cognitive re-education. From the perspective of predictive processing, a dominant framework in contemporary neuroscience, the brain is constantly generating predictions about the world and updating them based on sensory input. Under stress, prediction errors, mismatches between expectation and sensation, are treated as threats. The system rushes to eliminate them by reinterpreting sensation or reinforcing existing models. Discernment requires the system to tolerate prediction error without immediate correction. It allows a mismatch to exist. This tolerance is what differentiates discernment from analysis. Analysis seeks to resolve the mismatch cognitively. Discernment allows a mismatch to stabilize somatically first. As this tolerance grows, sensory confidence begins to return. Sensory confidence does not mean certainty about meaning. It means trust that perception itself is reliable enough to sit with. The system no longer needs to immediately justify or explain what it notices. This is why discernment reduces false questions. False questions are not questions that have wrong answers. They are questions that arise from unnecessary urgency. Why do I feel this way? What does this say about me? What should I do? These questions are often attempts to escape sensation, rather than understand it. When discernment stabilizes, many of these questions simply fall away, not because they are answered, but because they are no longer required. This is the cognitive relief that discernment offers. It does not provide conclusions. It removes pressure. As limbic patterning quiets and prefrontal engagement becomes less defensive, the mind begins to operate differently. Attention becomes more spacious. Thought becomes less compulsive. Interpretation slows. The system becomes capable of holding multiple signals without needing to reconcile them immediately. This is differentiation. Differentiation is the capacity to recognize difference without fragmenting. It allows this and that to coexist without hierarchy. It does not demand integration right away. In practical terms, this might show up as noticing that one conversation feels subtly draining, while another feels neutral without needing to label either as good or bad, or sensing that a particular option does not align without being able to articulate why, or recognizing that something once tolerated now feels off without constructing a story around it. These experiences can feel unsettling because they remove familiar anchors. Identity, narrative, and justification often provide a sense of stability. Discernment temporarily removes those supports, but what replaces them is more fundamental: orientation. Discernment reorients cognition around signal rather than story. It trains the mind to trust difference before interpretation. It allows perception to lead and meaning to follow, rather than the other way around. This is why discernment cannot be rushed. If the mind insists on immediate explanation, discernment collapses back into analysis. If urgency returns, the difference is flattened again. The system loses its ability to discriminate and reverts to old patterns. The cognitive shift required here is subtle but decisive, moving from meaning-seeking to signal discrimination. Meaning-seeking asks, "What does this say?" Signal discrimination asks, "Is this the same or different?" The first demands resolution. The second allows registration, and registration is what restores cognitive integrity after long override. This section matters because it prepares the listener for the next layer. Without understanding this cognitive shift, discernment can be mistaken for indecision, passivity, or confusion. With this understanding, it can be recognized as the nervous system reclaiming its ability to perceive accurately without pressure. The key reframe bears repeating. Discernment doesn't answer questions. It reduces false ones. When false urgency dissolves, cognition regains its proper role. It becomes a tool for articulation rather than a weapon against uncertainty. In the next section, we will move out of cognition and into the body, mapping how discernment is received somatically and how the nervous system learns to trust difference again at the level of sensation and regulation. The somatic blueprint, how the body learns what fits before discernment becomes a choice. It becomes a sensation, not a dramatic one. Not an insight that arrives with clarity or conviction, but a quiet, almost modest shift in how the body relates to what surrounds it. A subtle preference, a gentle leaning toward what feels coherent, and a soft withdrawal from what does not. This is the somatic blueprint of discernment. Long before the mind articulates "this is right for me" or "this no longer fits," the body has already begun adjusting. Muscles engage or release. Breath changes depth and rhythm. Energy gathers in some directions and dissipates in others. These movements are not decisions. They are registrations. Discernment, at the level of the body, is not forceful. It does not push away. It simply stops carrying what no longer needs to be held. For many people, this stage feels unfamiliar precisely because it is quiet. After long periods of override, where survival required endurance, tolerance, compliance, or performance, the body learned to suppress preference. It learned to hold tension without complaint, to remain present in misaligned environments, to keep breathing shallow and muscles braced as a baseline condition. When that pattern begins to unwind, The body does not announce it with certainty. It tests. The first sign is often muscular, not tension but preference. A slight relaxation when something aligns, a faint tightening when it does not. These are not defensive contractions. They are discriminating. The nervous system samples the field and registers where effort decreases. This distinction matters. Defensive tension is about protection. Discernment tension is about efficiency. The body begins to ask without words, where do I need to work less? This question is not cognitive. It is metabolic. From a neurobiological perspective, this reflects a recalibration of relevance. Under chronic stress, the body treats many stimuli as equally demanding. Muscular tone stays elevated. The system maintains readiness everywhere because it does not know where a threat will emerge. As safety increases, relevance becomes selective. The nervous system no longer needs to maintain uniform vigilance. It can afford to notice gradations. This is where discernment first takes root. Breath is often the next signal. Not a deliberate deep breath. Those are usually intentional and effortful. Instead, breath lengthens spontaneously in certain contexts. Exhalations deepen slightly. Pauses appear between breaths. These changes are not techniques. They are permissions. The body allows itself to rest more fully where it senses congruence. Just as importantly, breath often becomes shallower or more restrained around misaligned stimuli, not because of fear, but because the system no longer invests fully there. This can feel confusing. People often interpret this withdrawal as avoidance or shutdown, but discernment withdrawal is different from collapse. Collapse removes energy globally. Discernment withdraws energy selectively. The body is learning where it does not need to give. Energy follows relevance. As discernment develops, the nervous system stops distributing energy evenly across all stimuli. It begins with prioritizing. This is not judgment. It is an allocation. From the perspective of the salience network, involving regions such as the anterior insular and anterior cingulate cortex, this represents refinement. The salience network's role is to determine what matters. Under threat, it becomes hyperactive, flagging too much as important. Under safety, it becomes discerning. Signals that once demanded attention lose their pull. Stimuli that once felt compelling begin to feel heavy, unnecessary, or oddly distant. The body responds by disengaging gently. This disengagement often shows up as a quiet no, not spoken, not argued, simply enacted. You may notice you stop leaning forward. Your posture shifts back. Your shoulders drop. Your gaze softens or turns away. These are not dramatic refusals. They are micro-adjustments that signal, I don't need to be here in the same way. This is discernment without force. The body says no without having to justify itself. For people accustomed to being overruled, this can feel unsettling. There is often an impulse to override the body again, to re-engage, to explain, to push through. The old survival reflex whispers that withdrawal is dangerous, rude, or irresponsible. But what is happening here is not avoidance. It is accuracy. Interoceptive accuracy, the ability to sense and trust internal bodily signals, is central to discernment. Research consistently links higher interoceptive accuracy with better emotional regulation, decision-making, and resilience. But interoception does not return as insight. It returns through contrast. The body begins to feel different again. This environment requires effort. That one does not. This interaction drains. That one stabilizes. This task tightens my chest. That one leaves it neutral. Notice the absence of drama in these distinctions. Discernment does not require strong emotion. In fact, it often appears in its absence. That is one of its defining features. Emotion amplifies the signal. Discernment refines it. Another common somatic marker is energy withdrawal from misaligned stimuli. This is not fatigue. It is selectivity. You may notice certain conversations no longer hold your attention. Certain expectations feel heavier than before. Certain dynamics require effort you no longer have. This does not mean you are depleted. It means your nervous system is reallocating resources. Under long-term stress, energy is spent maintaining alignment with external demands. When that stress lifts, the system begins to conserve. It stops fueling what does not fit. This conversation can feel like a loss at first. Loss of motivation, loss of drive, loss of interest. But this is a transitional misinterpretation. What is actually occurring is neuroplastic recalibration. Neuroplasticity not only builds new pathways, it prunes old ones. Connections that are no longer reinforced weaken. Patterns that no longer serve lose momentum. In discernment, the body is learning what it no longer has to carry. That learning happens somatically before it happens cognitively. Another subtle shift occurs in how the body experiences no. For many people, no has historically been associated with conflict, rejection, or danger. The body learned to brace when saying no, anticipating backlash. Discernment retrains no as neutral, not defense, not attack, just information. The body begins to register misalignment without mobilizing the fight or flight. This is a significant nervous system achievement. It means the system can differentiate without escalating. This is what safety allows. Physiologically, this reflects improved autonomic flexibility. The nervous system can shift states without collapsing or overreacting. It can disengage without dissociating. It can reduce investment without threat. This flexibility is one of the hallmarks of restored regulation. As this capacity develops, people often report a new kind of clarity that is difficult to articulate. It is not certainty, it is ease in the presence of what fits. Ease in stepping back from what does not. Ease in not needing to explain either. This ease is not complacency, it is efficiency. The body learning where it does not need to work so hard. Importantly, discernment at this stage is not moral. The body is not labeling things as good or bad. It is simply noticing where coherence increases or decreases. This is why discernment precedes values. Values come later, when language returns. Here the body is doing something more primitive and more trustworthy, orienting toward coherence. One of the most profound shifts people notice is the reduction of internal conflict. When the body withdraws energy from misaligned stimuli, there is less internal argument, less forcing, less justification. This can feel like relief, but it is not relief as escape. It is relief as unburdening, and that brings us back to the core line of this section. Discernment is the body learning what it no longer has to carry. That learning is quiet, incremental, often invisible to others, but it is foundational. Without this somatic discrimination, cognitive discernment becomes brittle. It relies on rules, analysis, or ideals rather than felt coherence. With it, cognition can relax into support rather than control. In the next section, we will ground this process in lived experience, showing how discernment unfolds in real contexts, where the body begins to respond differently long before the person consciously decides that something has changed. For now, let this settle. If your body has begun withdrawing from certain things without anger, explanation, or drama, nothing has gone wrong. Your nervous system is learning what fits, and that learning does not require force. Field case study. When choice replaces reactivity, there is a moment that often arrives quietly, long after survival has ended. When the nervous system realizes something unfamiliar, there is time, not urgency-free bliss, not clarity, just time. This moment does not announce itself as freedom. It often arrives disguised as uncertainty. The old pressure is gone, but nothing rushes in to replace it. Options appear more than before, but they do not line up neatly. The person notices that they could move in several directions, but something inside does not lean toward all of them. This is where discernment enters lived experience. Not as confident, not as decisive, but as hesitation without fear. Imagine someone who has recently exited a period of sustained pressure. This pressure may have come from a relationship, a workplace, a system, or an internalized survival narrative. Whatever its source, it demanded responsiveness. Decisions were made quickly. Actions were taken to maintain safety, belonging, or stability. There was little room to ask what fit, only what worked. Now that the pressure has lifted, the external demands have softened. The crisis has passed. The environment is no longer hostile. And yet, instead of immediate relief or motivation, something slower unfolds. Choice. No choice as empowerment. Choice as availability. Multiple options now exist where once there was only necessity. Invitations arrive. Opportunities appear. Suggestions are made. And for the first time in a long while, the person does not feel compelled to respond immediately. This is disorienting. The mind, accustomed to urgency, searches for familiar signals. It scans for excitement, anxiety, obligation, anything that might recreate the old decision-making rhythm. It may even attempt to manufacture pressure. I should be doing something. I should be grateful. I should want this. But the body does not comply. Instead, the body registers subtle differences. This option feels neutral. That one feels heavy. Another feels faintly interesting. Not energizing, not draining, just present. The person may struggle to articulate these distinctions. There is no strong emotion to anchor them. No obvious red flag or green light. Just quiet variations in bodily response. This is discernment replacing reactivity. In survival mode, choice is compressed. The nervous system prioritizes speed over accuracy. Decisions are made to reduce threat, not to optimize alignment. Reactivity is efficient under pressure, but when pressure lifts, the same reactivity becomes destabilizing. Old urgency patterns attempt to return. The person may feel a pull to decide quickly, to commit, to move forward simply to escape the discomfort of ambiguity. This discomfort is not dangerous, but the nervous system may not immediately recognize the difference. The impulse to act resurfaces as a familiar strategy. If I choose something, at least I'll know where I stand. Discernment interrupts this impulse gently, not with restraint, with a delay. The person notices that they do not need to decide right now. Nothing collapses when they wait. No threat appears. No punishment follows. This waiting is not passive. It is attentive. During this period, the person may notice something unexpected. Saying no begins internally, not spoken, not defended, just felt. An invitation arises, and the body does not move toward it. The person does not feel rejection or resistance, only the absence of pull. There is no need to justify this internally. No narrative forms. The body simply does not engage. This is a quiet refusal. It is one of the most misunderstood stages of discernment. From the outside, it may look like indecision or lack of confidence. From the inside, it feels like something is settling. The body learning that it does not have to respond to every stimulus. This internal no often comes before any external yes, and that sequence matters. For people emerging from reactivity, the old pattern was reversed. External yes came first, often to maintain harmony, safety, or momentum, followed by internal consequences, resentment, exhaustion, confusion. Now the order shifts. The body responds first. The mind follows later. This reversal can feel slow. It can even feel uncomfortable, especially in cultures that equate decisiveness with strength. But the stabilizing effect is profound. Why? Because the nervous system is no longer being asked to justify it. In reactive states, decisions are often followed by internal negotiation. Did I do the right thing? Was that safe? Will this cost me later? The system remains vigilant even after action is taken. In discernment, the absence of internal pushback is the signal. The person may choose less, but they experience more coherence. This is why discernment is not confidence. Confidence is often performative. It requires projection. It announces itself. Discernment is quiet. It does not need witnesses. Another important shift occurs around timing. Reactivity collapses time. Everything feels immediate. Delays feel dangerous. Discernment restores temporal space. The person begins to feel that they can return to a decision later. Those options do not evaporate instantly. Not choosing now does not equal loss. This temporal expansion allows the nervous system to sample more information. Sensations evolve. Initial neutrality may become clarity. Mild interest may grow or fade. The body tracks these changes without urgency. This is neurobiological learning in action. The brain updates its predictive models based on new evidence. Waiting does not harm me. Not acting immediately is safe. I can tolerate ambiguity. These updates reduce stress signaling. The system spends less energy on threat monitoring and more on fine-grained discrimination. Discernment, then, is not a single moment of clarity. It is a process of calibration. Choice replaces reactivity not because the person becomes more certain, but because the nervous system becomes less threatened by uncertainty. This distinction is crucial. Many people assume that discernment should feel like knowing. When it does not, they override it. They push themselves back into urgency to regain a sense of control. But control is not the same as orientation. Orientation is knowing where you stand. Control is trying to decide what happens next. Discernment stabilizes the first before engaging the second. In lived experience, this often looks like fewer commitments made with more care, less explanation offered, more space allowed. The person may notice that they say less, not because they are withholding, but because they no longer need to justify their internal landscape. This can feel lonely at first. When urgency dissolves, so does the constant relational negotiation that once structured interaction. The person may feel less reactive, less animated. Others may comment on this shift, interpreting it as withdrawal or disinterest. But internally, something important is happening. The nervous system is learning that it does not need to perform to remain safe. Discernment is stabilizing because it reduces internal conflict. The body no longer has to argue with the mind. The mind no longer has to override the body. Decisions, when they come, feel quieter, but cleaner, and importantly, discernment does not eliminate mistakes. The person may still choose things that do not fit, but the recovery is faster. The body signals misalignment sooner. The exit costs less. This is another key marker, recovery speed. Under reactivity, misalignment lingers. The system remains activated long after the decision. Under discernment, misalignment is noticed and released with less drama. This is not emotional detachment. It is nervous system efficiency. By the end of this phase, the person may still struggle to articulate why certain options do not feel right, but they trust the absence of pull. They trust the quiet no. They are no longer driven by the need to fill space, justify existence, or prove alignment. Choice has replaced reactivity, not as empowerment rhetoric, but as lived physiology. The body has learned that it does not need to rush to remain intact. In the next section, we will explore how language re-enters this process, not as analysis or explanation, but as naming that supports orientation rather than collapsing it. Language and discernment. Naming without forcing. There is a noticeable shift that occurs once discernment begins to stabilize in the body. Language slows down, not because words disappear, and not because expression is suppressed, but because the nervous system no longer needs language to lead. Something more primary has taken its place. The body has begun to register difference on its own terms, without asking the mind to interpret or justify it. This is often misread as confusion or withdrawal. In reality, it is the restoration of sequence. For much of modern life, language is asked to do too much. It is required to explain the experience before it has settled, to justify preference before preference has formed, to defend sensation before sensation has had time to organize. Under conditions of pressure, language becomes a survival tool, fast, performative, persuasive. It is used to negotiate safety, belonging, and coherence in real time. Discernment interrupts this pattern, not by silencing language, but by removing its urgency. When discernment is active, the nervous system does not rush to label. It notices contrast first, a subtle leaning toward one thing, a quiet withdrawal from another. These movements are not yet concepts. They are directional tendencies, pre-linguistic, embodied signals that something fits better here than there. Language at this stage would only interfere if it tried to lead. This is where the mirror linguistic hypothesis becomes relevant, not as analysis, but as orientation. Within MLH, language is understood not merely as communication, but as a mirror that reflects the internal state into the nervous system. When the mirror is introduced too early, it does not clarify, it distorts. It reshapes the signal before the signal has stabilized. Discernment requires a delay in mirroring. The body must be allowed to choose before words arrive to confirm the choice. Many people experience this phase as oddly uncomfortable. There is a felt sense of knowing, this is not right, that feels closer, but when asked to explain, the words do not come, or if they do, they feel hollow, unsatisfying, or overconstructed. This does not mean discernment is weak. It means it is honest. Language is not the birthplace of discernment. It is its echo. When explanation is forced too early, discrimination collapses. The nervous system shifts from sensing to defending. The moment a person tries to justify their preference, they re-enter an evaluative field. They begin monitoring how their choice will be received, whether it is reasonable, and whether it makes sense to others. In that moment, the body's signal is overridden again, not by external pressure, but by internal translation. Discernment retreats. This is why so many people say, I knew it didn't feel right, but I couldn't explain why, so I talked myself out of it. The talking came too soon. Under discernment, the body does not require narrative coherence. It requires permission to remain unlabeled long enough for contrast to become stable. Only then can language arrive without distortion. This is a fundamental reordering of function. Language, in its healthiest role, does not discover truth. It confirms what the body has already organized. In reactive states, this order is reversed. Language is used to search, probe, argue, and justify. It becomes an exploratory tool under pressure. But exploration through language is metabolically expensive and often inaccurate when the nervous system is unsettled. Discernment changes the task. The nervous system begins to trust its own capacity to differentiate. Once that trust is established, language can return as a secondary function, not to decide, but to articulate. This is where the ineffable gap reappears, but in a new form. In earlier volumes, the gap was described as a defensive necessity, the space between stimulus and response where sovereignty could be protected. In discernment, the gap no longer needs defending. It becomes a generative space. The gap is no longer held open by vigilance. It is held open by confidence in internal reference. Within this space, preference forms without pressure. Meaning accumulates slowly. Words arrive when they are ready, not when they are demanded. This is why discernment often feels quieter than earlier stages of recovery. There is less commentary, less explanation, less urgency to share conclusions. The body is doing its work beneath the surface. People often worry here, shouldn't I be able to explain this? Shouldn't I know why? But explanation is not the goal of discernment. Fit is. Discernment is not concerned with being understood immediately. It is concerned with reducing internal friction. When something fits, the body relaxes around it. Breath adjusts. Muscular tension eases. Attention settles. Language that follows these shifts tends to be simpler. Fewer words are needed. There is less embellishment, less justification. Statements become more declarative, not because the person is more certain, but because the body is no longer arguing internally. I'm not available for that. That doesn't feel right for me. I'm going to pass. These phrases carry weight not because of their content, but because of their timing. They arrive after discernment, not before. This timing is everything. When language is used prematurely, it often becomes defensive. It anticipates objection. It tries to persuade. It performs coherence. In doing so, it reintroduces external orientation. How will this sound? How will this be received? Will this make sense? Discernment requires none of that. It is enough that the body has chosen. Within the mirror linguistic hypothesis, this shift can be understood as the restoration of a healthy mirror loop. The body generates a signal. The nervous system registers contrast. The mind observes without interference. Language then mirrors the settled signal back into expression. When this loop is intact, language feels supportive rather than burdensome. People often describe this as finding my words again, but the experience is different from earlier forms of expression. There is less urgency to speak and more precision when speech occurs. Words are fewer, but they land more cleanly. This is not detachment, it is alignment. Another subtle change occurs here around silence. Silence under pressure feels dangerous. It creates space where a threat might emerge. Silence invites interpretation from others. It demands explanation. Under discernment, silence becomes neutral, even supportive. The nervous system no longer rushes to fill space with words because it does not need to regulate others' perceptions to feel safe. Silence becomes a place where preference can continue forming without interruption. This is particularly important in relational contexts. In earlier stages, silence may have triggered anxiety. Should I say something? Am I being misunderstood? Am I missing an opportunity? In discernment, silence allows the body to remain in contact with its signal. It prevents premature commitment. It keeps the internal environment clear. Language returns when it serves that clarity, not when it threatens it. This is why discernment often appears slower from the outside. Others may perceive hesitation, lack of enthusiasm, or indecision, but internally the system is highly active, differentiating, sorting, refining relevance. The body is learning what it no longer has to carry. Language follows that learning, and when language does arrive, it does not seek permission. This is the deepest shift. Words spoken from discernment do not ask to be approved. They do not explain themselves into safety. They simply reflect a settled internal state. This does not mean they are inflexible. Discernment remains responsive. It can update as new information arrives, but it no longer collapses under social pressure to justify itself. In this way, discernment restores language by letting the body choose first. Language becomes confirmation, not construction. Expression becomes articulation, not negotiation. The gap becomes space, not defense. As we move into the next section, the focus will shift from language to observation, and how discernment can be supported without turning it into another task, another identity, or another optimization project. Discernment does not need language to begin. But when language finally arrives, it arrives standing on ground the body has already chosen. Observation practice, noticing without deciding. Discernment does not strengthen through action. It strengthens through exposure. Not exposure in the sense of challenge or testing, but exposure to difference without consequence. The nervous system needs repeated experiences of noticing contrast without being forced to act on it. This is how relevance recalibrates. This is how false urgency dissolves. For many people, this feels unfamiliar at first. Observation has long been paired with decision. Awareness has been treated as a precursor to action. If you notice something, you're expected to do something about it. Change it, fix it, commit, respond. Discernment interrupts that expectation. This practice is not about choosing. It is about allowing preference to register. The invitation is simple, but not easy. Notice the difference without responding to it. Notice what draws you closer, not dramatically, not romantically, not ideologically, but subtly. A small leaning, a sense of ease, a quiet curiosity that doesn't demand resolution. Notice what drains energy, not as a problem to solve, not as a flaw to correct, but as information. The slight heaviness, the tightening, the impulse to disengage, and then do nothing with that information. No explanation, no narrative, no adjustment, just noticing. At first, the mind may resist this. It will want to intervene, to categorize what you're noticing as good or bad, productive or unproductive, right or wrong. This reflex is not a failure. It is a habit formed under pressure, under long periods of override. The brain learns that noticing must be followed by action to restore safety. Observation without response feels incomplete, dangerous even. The system expects consequences. Discernment retrains this expectation. From a neurobiological perspective, what is happening here is a quiet recalibration of the salience network, the system responsible for deciding what matters. Under stress, salience becomes distorted. Everything feels urgent. Everything feels relevant. The brain assigns importance based on threat, novelty, or intensity rather than fit. When you notice a difference without deciding, you are teaching the nervous system something crucial. Relevance does not require reaction. This reduces cognitive load. Instead of the prefrontal cortex working overtime to interpret priorities and resolve, the system allows somatic preference to do its slower, more accurate work. The body begins filtering relevance before the mind engages. This is not passive. It is efficient. Neuroplasticity responds to repetition, not insight. Each time you notice a draw or a drain without acting, the brain updates its prediction models. It learns that it can tolerate ambiguity, that it can remain oriented without immediate closure, that safety does not depend on speed. Over time, this lowers background anxiety. People often report that this stage feels strangely spacious. There is less mental chatter, but also less certainty. This can be disorienting if you are accustomed to clarity being something you decide, rather than something that emerges. Here, clarity accumulates quietly. Another important shift occurs around energy. Many people are surprised to realize how much effort they expend maintaining alignment with things that subtly drain them. When discernment begins to function, this effort becomes visible, not as exhaustion, but as contrast. You may notice that certain conversations leave you flat. Certain environments feel heavier. Certain topics tighten your body slightly. Again, the instruction is not to avoid these things immediately. Avoidance is still a reaction. Instead, let the noticing stand on its own. This allows the nervous system to separate recognition from response. That separation is foundational. Without it, discernment collapses back into urgency. There is also a relational aspect to this practice. When you stop deciding quickly, others may fill the space for you. They may interpret your pause as uncertainty or disengagement. This can trigger old patterns, the urge to reassure, explain, or provide clarity. Notice that urge too. The desire to resolve others' discomfort is often stronger than the desire to stay with your own signal. Discernment requires tolerating that tension without acting on it. This is not a withdrawal, it is internal alignment. From a psychological perspective, this practice builds distress tolerance, not in the sense of enduring pain, but in tolerating non-resolution. The system learns that it can remain present without collapsing uncertainty into action. That learning stabilizes choice later. Importantly, this practice does not ask you to become indifferent. Sensitivity is not reduced. In fact, it often increases. What changes is compulsion. You may find that sensations feel clearer, preferences sharper, misalignments are more obvious, but the urgency to respond diminishes. This is discernment maturing. The body becomes more honest when it is not being interrogated. As this practice continues, many people notice a reduction in mental fatigue. This is not because life has become simpler, but because the brain is no longer trying to solve every signal immediately. Decision-making becomes less effortful because fewer false questions are being asked. You are no longer deciding whether something fits. You are noticing how it fits or doesn't. That difference matters. The rule here is gentle but firm. No fixing, no deciding, just noticing the difference. If you find yourself explaining, pause. If you find yourself concluding, pause. If you find yourself planning, pause. Return to noticing. Discernment does not need your help. It needs your permission. As this section closes, trust that something important is happening, even if it feels subtle. The nervous system is relearning how to assign relevance without threat. The body is refining preference without defense. The mind is learning to wait. In the next section, we will move into a brief self-reflection prompt, not to generate answers, but to allow internal contact to surface naturally. Self-reflection prompt: there is a difference between asking a question and demanding an answer. This prompt is not an exercise. It is an invitation. By this point in the episode, the nervous system has already been doing its work. Discernment has been introduced not as judgment, not as evaluation, not as decision-making, but as quiet differentiation, a subtle leaning, a preference that forms before explanation. This question is meant to fill that place, not the mind that explains, not the voice that justifies, but the body that already knows what feels closer. So the invitation is simple. What do I feel drawn toward without needing to explain why? Let the question land gently. You may notice an immediate response. You may notice nothing at all. You may notice a sensation before a thought. You may notice resistance to the question itself. All of this is information. There is no need to search, no need to scan memory, no need to perform insight. If something arises, let it arise without holding it. If nothing arises, let that be complete. Discernment does not arrive through effort. It arrives through permission. This question is not asking you to commit. It is not asking you to choose. It is not asking you to act. It is simply offering a moment where preference can exist without consequence. Notice whether something in you leans, even slightly. Notice whether something relaxes when the need to explain is removed. Notice whether the absence of explanation itself feels relieving, and then let the question go. No journaling, no answers required, no conclusion necessary. The value here is not in what you find, but in allowing the question to be present without urgency. Discernment strengthens when the nervous system learns that noticing does not demand action. Let this question pass through you, the same way sensation does, briefly, honestly, without obligation. In the next section, we will integrate what has been unfolding, not by defining it, but by anchoring discernment as a stabilizing capacity that reduces false urgency and restores trust in the internal signal. Integration: discernment restores trust. Discernment is often mistaken for a mental skill, a kind of refined thinking, a sharper intellect, better judgment. But what has been unfolding through this episode is something quieter and far more consequential. Discernment is not an upgrade of thought. It is the restoration of trust, not to trust in certainty, not to trust in conclusions, but trust in the body's ability to register what fits, what doesn't, and what no longer needs to be carried. This is why discernment feels unfamiliar to many people at first. For a long time, trust has been outsourced to urgency, to authority, to narratives that promise safety in exchange for speed. When the nervous system has lived under override, trust becomes associated with decisiveness, confidence, and clarity delivered quickly. Anything slower feels risky. Anything quieter feels unreliable. Discernment undoes that conditioning. It does not arrive with answers. It arrives with a reduction of false urgency, reduction of noise, reduction of the pressure to explain, and in that reduction something stabilizes. What returns first is not certainty, it is permission. Permission to pause without collapsing. Permission to feel different without defending it. Permission to let preference exist before justification. This is why discernment cannot be forced. The moment it is forced, it becomes judgment. The moment it is defended, it becomes identity. The moment it is rushed, it becomes control. Discernment is the nervous system remembering that it does not need to react to everything it perceives. This is the foundation of autonomy. Autonomy is often imagined as freedom of choice, the ability to decide quickly, to assert oneself, to act independently. But that model assumes that all choices are equally available, equally safe, equally real. Discernment reveals that they are not. Some options drain energy the moment they are considered. Some environments quiet the body without effort. Some directions require constant justification to maintain. Others require none. These are not thoughts. They are physiological recognitions. When discernment returns, the body begins to trust its own filtering again, not through analysis, but through coherence. Something aligns, and the system settles. Something misaligns, and energy withdraws. This is not judgment. Judgment compares. Discernment distinguishes. Judgment ranks options against a moral or cognitive scale. Discernment notices resonance without ranking. Judgment asks, is this right or wrong? Discernment asks nothing, it registers. This distinction matters deeply because judgment keeps the nervous system activated. It demands defense. It creates winners and losers, correct and incorrect, good and bad. Discernment does none of this. Discernment simply reduces what the system has to hold. This is why discernment restores trust. Trust does not return because you are suddenly certain. It returns because you are no longer forcing yourself to stay with what doesn't fit. Many people mistake certainty for safety, but certainty is often a compensatory strategy, a way to quiet anxiety by collapsing complexity into conclusions. Discernment moves in the opposite direction. It allows complexity to exist without panic. You don't need to know why something feels wrong to step back from it. You don't need to explain why something feels right to stay near it. You don't need to prove your preference to yourself or anyone else. This is where trust begins to rebuild, not in correctness, but in congruence. The nervous system learns something crucial here. I can notice a difference without being punished for it. I can withdraw energy without justifying it. I can let things fall away without replacing them immediately. This learning is neuroplastic. It happens through repetition, not insight. Each time the body leans away from something misaligned and nothing catastrophic happens, trust strengthens. Each time the system stays near what fits and does not need to perform to maintain it, trust deepens. Over time, discernment becomes less noticeable, and that is the point. When discernment is working, it does not announce itself. It does not create drama. It does not demand recognition. It simply narrows the field. This narrowing is not a constriction. It is a relief. Relief because fewer things need to be managed. Relief because fewer signals compete for attention. Relief because the system no longer has to argue with itself. This is why discernment is not certainty. Certainty locks. Discernment adjusts. Certainty resists change. Discernment updates quietly as the field changes. Certainty needs defense. Discernment needs only awareness, and this is why discernment is not control. Control attempts to manage outcomes. Discernment simply stops investing in misalignment. Control keeps the nervous system braced. Discernment allows the system to soften without collapsing. Control asks, how do I make this work? Discernment allows the question, why am I carrying this at all? This is the shift that restores autonomy. Not autonomy as independence, autonomy as internal coherence. When discernment stabilizes, decisions begin to feel less dramatic. Boundaries become easier to sense before they are articulated. You may notice that you say less, explain less, and justify less, not because you are withholding, but because less is required. This is not a withdrawal, it is refinement. The system is no longer reacting to noise. It is responding to a signal, and the signal does not shout. Signal does not persuade. Signal does not argue. Signal does not rush. It simply fits, or it doesn't. This is the kind of trust that cannot be given by another person, a belief system, or a framework. It emerges from repeated experiences of listening and not being overridden internally or externally. Discernment rebuilds trust by teaching the nervous system something it may not have known for a long time. You are allowed to notice difference without making a case for it. That permission is the beginning of the edge, not edge as defense, edge as a definition, and that is where we go next. Because once discernment reveals difference, the system must learn how to hold that difference without collapsing or explaining it away. That holding is not a force, it is a boundary. Discernment does not end with clarity. It ends with difference, and difference, once felt, changes the field. Up until now, the nervous system has been relearning how to notice. Stillness allowed sensation to return. Sensation allowed orientation to stabilize. Orientation made discernment possible, the quiet recognition that not everything carries the same weight, the same cost, the same resonance. But discernment alone does not protect what it reveals. Once the system begins to feel what fits and what does not, a new pressure emerges, not from the outside, but from within. A subtle tension forms around the question, what happens next? Because noticing the difference without the edge leaves the system exposed. Discernment says, this feels different from that. Boundary asks, what am I willing to hold, and what must I release? This is where many people falter, not because they lack insight, but because they have been taught to confuse boundary with aggression, withdrawal, or rejection. For a long time, boundary has been framed as something sharp, defensive, or relationally costly, something that requires justification, something that creates conflict. But a boundary in its biological sense is not a force, it is containment. The nervous system cannot maintain a signal without an edge. Without some form of boundary, the signal disperses. It leaks. It becomes diluted by obligation, expectation, and old patterns of accommodation. Discernment reveals difference. The boundary protects differences. This protection does not begin with words. It begins with posture, pacing, distance, and energy allocation. It begins with the system learning that it does not have to stay available to everything it perceives. A boundary is not a reaction to a threat. It is a response to fit, and this is why boundary follows discernment, not before it. If a boundary is placed without discernment, it becomes rigid. If discernment is present without boundaries, it becomes exhausting. The two belong together. As this episode closes, notice what has shifted quietly. Perhaps you are less interested in convincing, less inclined to explain, less willing to override a sense of misalignment just to maintain continuity. That is not avoidance, that is preparation. The boundary does not arrive as confrontation. It arrives as a return of edge, the gentle but unmistakable line where the body says enough without hostility, and yes, without collapse. In the next episode, we will explore boundaries not as a psychological concept, but as a somatic function, how the nervous system learns to hold shape, how edge returns without armor, how saying no internally often precedes any external expression, because you cannot participate meaningfully in the world if you cannot feel where you end. Episode 5 Boundary. The return of edge. Thank you for entering this field of exploration and returning to self. The matrix is not something you escape. It is something you learn to feel and perceive. Once you begin to recognize it through feeling and self-awareness, perception becomes less confined by certainty and more guided by awareness. You've been listening to The Resonance Matrix, Volume 3, The Silencing Field Return to Self, Episode 4 Discernment Separating Signal from Noise. I'm James Miller.